Boker Tov, good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to see everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. We are going to actually go one step further today as we carry on understanding the different Mefarshim. We're going to look at the Meshech Chochma. Why are we doing this? I actually had a new series in mind, a completely new idea, which I was excited to do, but it's a little bit choppy, and I don't want to start without a little bit of a runway to get quite far into our learning together. I want to thank Dr. Yeager for pushing me to Dr. Yeager said, how could we go through the Mefarshim and not look at the Meshech Chochma? So I said, so it is. He is absolutely right. He is absolutely right, and so we're going to go back into this perspective. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to Elliot and Shendel Horowitz for sponsoring today on the Baba Yom Yortzeit of Yosef Tzvi Ben Arav Pesach Halevi, Harry Horowitz, upon his 33rd Yortzeit. That is Elliot's father. He was a person who was dedicated to the Jewish community, serving as the chairman of the board of Eitz Chaim, also on the Yeshiva of Flatbush, among many other things. And one of the greatest accomplishments is producing an Elliot, which is a tremendous light to the world. So thank you, Be'ezras Hashem. He should continue to get nachas from his growing family. Also want to thank Yoel and Shmuel, who are sponsoring today as we approach the Yortzeit for Yoel's mother. What number are we coming to?
40.
What?
40.
40. Wow. So that's a long time.
I'm only 39.
I'm taking a moment. Yoel's mother was a daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she entered her own as she was a teenager in Seattle, Washington. She was also, when she spent time around the country, in Memphis, in Missouri, and she was a preschool teacher in Memphis, in the Baron Hirsch Synagogue. She was loved by all the children that she taught, as well as the parents alike. That's a big accomplishment. It was a big shock to the Memphis community. They've dedicated the playground to her at the preschool. She was known to be very careful with Lashon Hara and watched her speech, and that is what is reflected upon her matzeva. She also raised her family b'derech haTorah, which is evident from her the children that we get to see. Be'ezras Hashem nishmasa Eden. Let us learn a little bit today together. Ricky, as well. Today's the Baba Yom Yortzeit for Dr. David Adler, and it's been a very special Shabbos. But I'm very glad that today, on the actual Yortzeit itself, we get to learn a little bit together, in memory of somebody who I viewed as a mentor and sometimes was even fortunate to call a friend. With somebody who's so great and so big, it's hard to even say that, but I felt the love and affection that he showed me and showed so many other people in his infinite care for other people. One of the things that was the most amazing just to us in his last year when he was fighting for his life is one of the things that was most important to him was to fight that no one should see his pain, not to bother his family. That was his biggest achievement, and he would never express that he was in pain unless he was asked, because he was able to do that more than a Herculean effort, and some people in this room know just how special he was and will continue to be in our memories. Nishmasa Eden. We're also going to just learn today for my grandmother, who's Yortzeit, is Baba Yom today as well, and we have Ayelet Tikva Shena. Shena is my grandmother, my Baba, and her Yortzeit is today. Her she should have an Aliyas Neshama. Let us learn about one of the most stellar, fascinating, unique, and unusual people that we are going to meet throughout our course of learning. His name is Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. He lived over 100 years ago, died in 1926. He was born in 1875, and you can find his books all over. The Meshech Chochma is in a standard base Medrash. He's not found on the page of the Mikras Gedolos. His Pirush is too long to be fitted there. It's ready. The typeset had been finished by the time he came around. But nonetheless, his Pirush is found everywhere. It's available on Sefaria. It's easy to access his Pirush, at least in the words. But as an individual, he is really stands in a category of his own. Let's just think about this for a moment. He was actually born to a very well-to-do family. When his in the introduction to one of the Meshech Chochmas, the one that I own, it describes that the Rav of the town where he was born was not appreciated by the community, and they stopped paying his salary. So the Rav of their town was impoverished. Now, in Eastern Russia, no one was really doing, in Eastern Europe, no one was doing great. So if you're impoverished, that means to say you don't have anything to eat. So his mother took it upon herself to finance and support the Rav of that community. And when the people found out about this, a blessing was given that because of your care for the sage, your child that you have will be of stellar material, and he was, in fact. That was the blessing that she received. Ultimately, he got married at a young age, 17, 18 years old, and for a number of years, he just really subsumed himself in his own studies. His wife, Chaya, opened up a business, which enabled him to be able to focus on his own studies in Torah. He was not involved in a particular yeshiva, so we're not speaking of those who came from the academy, like in the previous weeks, like the Netziv, like the Torah Tzimima, who really were in the greatest of yeshivas in Volozhin at the time. Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk was under the radar. He was learning in Bialystok, where they lived, which was a very wonderful city, which had many Torah sages, and he did his own thing. And a few people knew of his greatness, but generally speaking, it wasn't because he was advertising it. And although he was offered many positions in Rabbanos from across Europe, in Pinsk, even in New York, in Yerushalayim, in fact, he turned all of those down, and he continued to engage in his studies until finally, at a certain point, he accepted the position in Dvinsk. Now, at those times, the communities were usually split. There was the Hasidic community, and there was the Lithuania, we'll call it the Misnagdim, or the Yeshiva community, and Litvish community. And so, technically speaking, it's in Latvia, but yes, it's all the same, basket, but that changed every Thursday, So he accepted the position of the rabbi in Dvinsk, and it turned out that a year later, he attained having a colleague who was the rabbi of the Hasidic community, whose name was Rav Yosef Rosen. Rav Yosef Rosen is on top of the next page, was also had a different name. He was called the Rogachover Gaon. And there's famous stories about the interaction between these two people, whose intellects were on the same level, and they had immense respect for each other. So when people would come to ask a question to the Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk, he would say, why are you asking me? It'll take me the whole night to study to find this. The Rogachover Gaon will expend it in one moment. And when they went to the Rogachover Gaon, he said to them, go ask the Kohen, because that was Rav Meir Simcha HaKohen of Dvinsk, and they had immense respect for each other. And the intellectual stories are stories of fireworks of the mind, as how they interacted with each other. The Rogachover was very famous for writing most of his responsum on postcards. Right, so he'd have in very small writing. He wouldn't even write the answers. He would just write the sources to things. Really, really fascinating individual. At the same time, he was a very dedicated community member. Just to give you a sense of that level of dedication, you take a look at the bottom of page 2 on the right-hand side. I actually found the obituary in the Jewish Chronicle, 1927, of Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog was to be, in a decade, the second chief rabbi of Israel. His grandson is currently the president of Israel. I just met him last week, actually. It was wonderful because we davened in his minyan for my sons on Thursday, and my son got an aliyah after him because he's a Halevi. So he got Levi, President Herzog, my son got Shlishi. It was wonderful. It was a very special opportunity. That was the day after he came back from Davos, Switzerland, where Switzerland threatened arresting him because of war crimes. Wow, what a world we're living in. God bless the Swiss and the entire world. But Rav Herzog, Rav Halevi, not referring to the Jewish Swiss.
No, I said Ordnat.
Ordnat, right. Rav Herzog wrote a obituary, and it's a 6-column obituary of the Jewish Chronicle. He starts off by saying, I was reading the Jewish Chronicle on Saturday. And by the way, people say, yes, he was reading the newspaper on Shabbos. That became a real issue when it came to the Netziv, remember? So he writes in his article, I was reading the newspaper, and I noticed that Rav Meir Simcha passed away in 1926, and nobody said anything. And then he spends 2 columns explaining why the Jewish world has sunken into ignoble, intellectual, abysmal vacuum if they don't understand what happened when he died. So he said, because you don't understand what just happened, I'm going to explain it to you. And he spent the next 4 columns explaining who Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk is. He was talking to the Western jury who had no idea of the significance of what just happened, that in 1926 Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk died. And so just a few lines from his obituary. Again, it's written in these columns in the newspaper in the way it was in those days. And so if you take a look at the bottom of the page, he says at the top, he says, Rav Meir Simcha, great master of the Torah that he was by no means a scholar of the recluse type. From morning to evening, like Moses of old, he toiled indefatigably for the material as well as the spiritual welfare of his people. His heart was as large as his mind. We're going to see some explanations of the Meshech which reflect that description of him. His opinions on points of Jewish law and ritual law was eagerly sought for by the rabbis all over the world, who acknowledged his authority as supreme. That is true. In fact, of his published works, the works that he published in his life were called the Or Sameach, which obviously is a play on his name. Meir Simcha is the one who lights up in happiness. Or Sameach is light of happiness. That's how he quoted his book without focusing on himself, but it was a play, an innuendo on his name. The entire Or Sameach system and movement today is named after him. Right? All the Or Sameachs around the world are named on his book, which he wrote. It was written on the Gemara and on the Rambam. It was so popular that in the Volozhin Yeshiva, when the next volume came out, they would give out half-an-hour increments to the Bachrim, which would go till 3:30 in the morning to be allowed to read the next volume of Or Sameach. Now, which is fascinating because he was not coming from the academy. That's what's so amazing. Here was a shul rav engaged and submerged in the complexities of the Jewish community, writing, and the academy was appreciating it. That's very unusual, right? That's what he's describing over here. He loved his people passionately. During the Great War, that's referring to, why didn't he call World War I? Because he's writing in 27, right, of course. They thought that was the only war that had to be called in Great War, right? The World War II came later. When Dvinsk was subjected to daily aerial bombardment by the Germans, he would not move from his post, declaring that as long as a minion of Jews remained in the city, he would stay with them, sharing their trials and dangers. Because who could leave Dvinsk upon German bombardment? Who leaves when things go bad? The rich and the able, right? Who stays behind? The impoverished and the disabled. And so therefore he said, I'm staying. As long as there's a minion of people here, I will make that minion. That was his response and his relationship to community. Right? This is always the way it goes. When Jewish communities fold, it doesn't go in one moment. It takes time. And then the question is, does the captain remain in the ship or not? And that's a question, and that he answered that question. During the Bolshevik occupation, he was thrown into jail or into gaol, along with the heads of the Russian church. But after the Bolshevik authorities had learnt what type of man he was, they soon released him. It's just amazing just to understand the type of person. So sometimes it's important to appreciate he was not the type of leader who was sitting there in the ivory tower and sometimes people portray him as such, which is wonderful. If your only currency is Torah study, and if we have to make everybody just a paradigm of Torah study, then you're going to say, yes, he was the greatest scholar. He was, but he was also a servant of the community. And that takes much more time than the Torah study, let me tell you. That's what's important to appreciate of this as well. The picture above the column is a person by the name of Isser Harel. Does anybody know who Isser Harel was? Right, one of the famous heads of the Mossad. He was responsible for the Eichmann kidnapping and ultimate bringing to trial down in South America. Very famous person, and he grew up in Dvinsk, and he writes in his memoirs that when he was a child, he remembers. This is in his own memoirs. He describes that there was a time in Dvinsk where there was a catastrophe which happened, and it's as you could see in the map in Dvinsk. It's right there along the river, right? This river went through the center of Dvinsk, and there was a particular time where the river froze in Dvinsk, but the upstream had not frozen. So there was so to speak, almost like a glacier, like in the town itself, but above the town was not frozen, which threatened immediate flooding of the town, because as the rains would swell, then the waters would not be able to flow, they would overflow their banks and flood the town. And so the authorities tried to use dynamite to blow through the frozen area in the city to no effect. And the townspeople were all gathering, and then finally the mayor said, call the rabbi, right? This is always what happens when all else fails, right? So they called out the rabbi, who came out, and this is what Isar Harel describes as a young boy. He remembers Rav Meir Simcha coming out in his talis and his tefillin. He stood there with everybody gathered around, and he prayed. And as he was praying, a large cracking sound was heard, and the ice broke. Hey, that's what he remembers. As you can see, he was not an observant man, but this is one of his childhood memories about the Rav of his town, Rav Meir Simcha Devinsk. One of the things that fascinating memories which is related to him. The book that we're going to be studying is a book which was not published in his lifetime. He wrote the notes on the Meshech Chochma, which is his commentary on the Torah, and he left them unpublished, although it is said by those who spent time with him that this was his most treasured work. Meaning to say, the Or Sameach, everybody read, and it was available to all. But the Meshech Chochma he kept in the safe in his innermost sanctum, and ultimately was published later on by Rabbi Menachem Mendel Zaks, who was one of his Talmidim, and published the Meshech Chochma, which we have today. And this work is a remarkable work. With Dr. Egiaga, what's the term you use for this? His methodology? Halachic drush. What's fascinating about it is here you have a person who really does have the breadth and depth of Torah, right? So this individual over here, this is not like he's looking up anything, right? He really has it all, okay? And he's able to take all halacha, all agada, and all Kabbalah, and he's able to synthesize that into the Torah setting, and at the same time with remarkable perspective on contemporary issues and also creative ways of reading the Torah. That's what he does. It's remarkable what Rav Meir Simcha comes out with. We're going to look at a few examples. I had to apologize. There's so much. Like every section, every essay is so rich, and there's so much to say. It's very hard to even know where to start or to end. But let's look at a few examples as well. This first example always strikes me as so powerful. It's such a simple thing. It's an unusual word. The word is that it describes and God spoke all these matters, saying, what is the next pasuk in this? This is Shmos Perek Chav. What happens right after this pasuk? Anochi Hashem Elokecha, which is the Aseres HaDibros. The Meshech Chochma says, but wait a second, that doesn't make sense here, because usually when you have the word Lemor, what does Lemor mean? Vaydaber Hashem El Moshe Lemor. What does that mean? To say over. Why is it said in there such a way? Because here is God speaking to Moses. Moses, speak to the nation of Israel afterwards when I finish telling it to you. But wait a second. Who's the audience of Anochi Hashem Elokecha? All of Israel. So who's the Lemor? That's a very simple question. Like, meaning, it's not just me and you in the room. It's all of us. This is national revelation. If that's the case, who's the Lemor? Says the Meshech Chochma, and this is just, again, such a simple observation. He says, in the first line, he says, this is not the same Lemor to Sevo like anywhere else in the Torah. Right? Because he says, everybody is here. The second line, he says, Rambam, Shekol Ikar, Ikrei HaKabbalah, Hu Einoi Mina Movsim. We do not believe in the tradition of Judaism because of incredible miracles that occurred. Shekol HaMamin Mitzad Zeh Yesh Bilvavoy Dofi. Because if you believe in based on miracles, and you say, well, maybe some other, magician could do some great illusions. Rak mitzad shetaf reish elev avoseinu shana rabbanon avoseinu hema edim ne'emanim shegiu latachlis hanavua v'rou kvod Hashem v'shamu aseres hadvarim v'heim manchilei hakabbalah dor. The Rambam points out the reason why we believe in what we believe is because all of our ancestors saw the same thing, and they told it to their children, their children to their children, their children to their children, their children to their children, and we're their children. Which means there's never been a claim of national revelation outside of the scope of Torah, right? Christianity and Islam, when they were trying to invent their new religions, that nobody said national revelation, right? Yoshka and Paul, it was like, Paul was on the way to Nazareth, right? and Muhammad was having a bad dream out there in the Saudi Arabia. And then they came back and said, folks, look what I just heard. We're going to go and kill everybody for our religion. That happened with one person by themselves. Did anybody say, wait a second, Muhammad, maybe you had indigestion, right? Maybe you're just having a bad dream, right? We don't have any, there was no one with you, right? That doesn't happen in Judaism. Now, if you were to create a new religion, right? So let's say you wanted to create Islam, right? So you should claim national revelation. You should say like this. Muhammad should come back and say, all of you folks, every one of you saw God speak to you. And they'll be like, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't remember that, right? No, your parents. So yeah, but our parents didn't tell us that, right? So that's the problem, is you can't create a lie which affects everybody, right? You can create a lie which affects you, and you can even believe in that, really, in that lie. And if you're very charismatic, maybe other people will also believe you and go and, conquer peninsulas. But in the end of the day, right, the only religion which has actually ever claimed national revelation, because you can't claim it, you can't tell other people that they believe that this happened without them all having the same consensus, that's Judaism. Which means that Judaism says that God spoke to all of Israel. And therefore the Pasuk says, Lemor. Because you're going to keep telling it to your children and your children's children. None of us say, my tradition in my family is that actually happened in East Africa, right? No, my tradition in the family it wasn't on a mountain, it was in a valley somewhere in Cyprus. No, right? Means that there's no different traditions because we all agree with the same basic tenet. Because you can't make up history. You can't make up national history. You can make up what happened to you, but you can't, and that's the lemor over here. So the Aseres Ladibros are an expression of how tradition works. And that this is observation.
You can make up national history.
You can. You can. Yeah, you have to drill it in long enough. You're right. But again, you're right. But as is pointed out, all you need to do now is do a little research, and you will see the fallacies in it. Right? Meaning to say, there's enough counter information to be able to contest that. Christianity and Islam do base themselves on national revelation, meaning they don't disagree with this point. Right? They agree that the Jews did get some revelation, and then there was just abrogation of that information at some point in time, according to Christianity and Islam. Right? This is all in the Old Testament, certainly. Other piece things that he does is just some beautiful observations that the Meshech will do. So, for instance, this is an example of just sort of in the realm of Jewish thought. So that we know that there's a debate as to why it is that God told us to do animal sacrifice, right? So the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim very famously says that animal sacrifice is because we were exposed to idolaters, to pagan folks, and those pagan folks are bringing sacrifices all the time. So what God did was he sort of pivoted away. He took that practice which was prevalent in the pagan world and he said, do it to me, right? That's why the Rambam understands it. And if you're raising an eyebrow, that's what many people did to the Rambam too. And they said, how could that be, right? The Ramban says, no, there are certain spiritual connections which are happening in the heavens, which are occurring when a person does this specific rite and ritual. It's not about, we'll call it's inherent rather than contingent upon what else is going on here. Now, most people, when they read the Rambam, have forgotten that the Rambam wrote another book, and that's called the Yara Chazaka. And the Rambam wrote a book in the end of Hilchos Me'ilah. The Rambam does talk about the value of korbanos independently. So you have to try to figure out how the Rambam works, right? Because you can't accuse the Rambam just by thin slicing him in the Moreh Nevuchim. But, be it as it may, the Meshech Chochma says, if you want to try to synthesize these opinions, maybe it's referring to two stages in Jewish history. When they would sacrifice on a bama. What's a bama? So private altars. And those were allowed from the time that the nation of Israel entered into the land of Israel and they established the Mishkan. And then when the Mishkan was destroyed again, 369 years ago, later, till the time, through about a 70-year period, till they established the Beis HaMikdash, in that period of time, they were allowed what's called bamot. The bama was essentially, I put up together a pile of stone in my backyard, and I have my own minyan, right? And we have a sacrifice. It's very convenient, especially when it gets cold. In the cul-de-sac, we have our own little bama, right? So that kind of service is to, as the Rambam says, is to move away from the avodah zarah, from pagan worship. That was, so to speak, a step away from pagan worship. But when they came to the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash, that's what the Ramban was saying, which is the idea, which is remarkable, because then what it does is it saves grace on the Rambam, because the Rambam's idea seems very much limited to the circumstances that we're in. Says the Meshech Chochma, yes, that's why it was such a limited period of time. That the Bamas were operational as well. Fascinating observation. Now, he speaks extensively on leadership. There's so many examples of leadership. Here's a few examples, and he reflected these very much on his own life. One is we're about to read in this week's parasha, in Parshas B'Shalach. It describes how Vayisam Malach Elokim Halech Lifnei Mechanei Yisrael Vayelech Me'achareihem Vayisa Amud Anan Mifneihem Vayamod Me'achareihem. So we have the angel of God, this is in source 4, who goes from in front of them, goes behind them, and the cloud goes from in front of them to behind them. So what do we understand that to mean? Why was it necessary the cloud came behind them? That was to protect them. Good. What about the angel? Like, who's the angel? What was his name? Right? Like, do we know what the angel's name is? We forget about that. There's a cloud and an angel. So the Mefarshim are going to spend a lot of time discussing this. Says the Meshech Chochma, again, this is where he sort of breaks rank with everybody else before him. And he says, you know what it is? Vayisam Malach Elokim, in source 5, Ha'olech B'nei Machane Yisrael, Vayelech Me'achareihem, Zeh Moshe, Shenikra Kan Malach Elokim. Here's Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, like, think about the psychology of that for a moment as well. Here you have the sea. Everybody's terrified. The Egyptians are behind them, right? And now the sea starts to split, right? And at this point in time, so where does Moshe go? Moshe Rabbeinu goes behind them. Now, on the one hand, you could say, that is because he's now putting himself between the Egyptian forces and the Israelites. But another thing he's doing is a remarkable description of leadership, which is what the Meshech Chochma goes on to elaborate, which is allowing the people of Israel to become the leaders. Which means to say is that if it's just about, like, I'm going to go in, okay, that's great. We know you're great, right? He says, I'm going to allow you to be great. I'm going to show you can do this. Right? So he takes, so to speak, he makes the space for the people to also enter as well, which is one of the things that he observes is leadership from behind, not like as in behind as in the Arab forces and how they work in the army, but in this sense, allowing them to take the step necessary to the sea as well. Another example of this is by the bris milah. When does Avraham Avinu get his name Avraham? Is when he's about to do the bris milah. Why? Says the Meshech Chochma. Avram is like this really fascinating proposition. Everybody's living in Mesopotamia in a pagan reality, and this funny fellow called Abraham is talking about monotheism, right? And like everybody doesn't really like this because it's like doesn't jive with their sensibilities. And also, my lifestyle's a lot freer when I have lots of gods, right? Because then they can all have a fight, and I can just placate all of them and carry on with my completely decrepit lifestyle. And Avraham is claiming that it all adds up, right? There's one responsibility to one force in the universe, to one omnipotent, omniscient God. So this is like a very disturbing thing. So he carries on preaching, we carry on ignoring him, and from time to time we jail him, right? That's kind of how the pagans viewed Abraham in the Mesopotamian region. Until a certain point where his religion took on a new stage, a new platform. When was that? Says the Meshech Chochma explains that was when he did bris milah. Why? He says because look at the third line where he says in source 7. He says lachein b'mitzvas milah towards the end of the line shemal nashas kol ben bayis v'nefesh atzmoi hera shemu'umas etzloi beloy pikbuk hanavua v'ashkacha elokis befrat. It's all nice to have all these claims, but like tachlis, right? He says, oh, wait a second, they're having a medical procedure now. Right? You say now it's not just a claim, it costs, right? It means something. לכן אמר כי עכשיו על ידי הימולאיס עצמוי ובנוב ילאב המון גויים שיסמס שתעשה באלוקוס לכל היהודים שמוי שבלוי שום פיקבוק הוא עושה ויהיה לרב. Some people like to make noise because they just like to be influencers, right? And they want people to notice them. And so maybe Avraham Avinu was just looking for attention. No. He's actually for real. He's circumcising him. He's circumcising his entire, meaning his God told him this is the way this is going to be for whatever reason it is, and he's doing it. So then suddenly at that point in time, people said, oh, you know what? He's the real deal. And that's at that point in time when there was a cost to it. That's when Avraham Avinu's faith took on a new meaning, which also means to say is leadership, which is leadership in action, not leadership in speech, which is what he's describing over here. Similarly, take a look at this is in Parshas Noach. He makes an unbelievable observation. He says, if you look at the beginning of Moshe and Noach's life and contrast them, you have, at the beginning of Noach's life, he's called Ish Elokim, the man of God. At the end of Noach's life, after the Teva episode, he's called Ish Adama. He's like the man who's like kind of tilling the soil, and it ends up, he makes a vine, and we all know the end of the story of the vine episode, right? Then we come to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu at the beginning is called an Ish Mitzri, right? The daughters of Yisrael, when they find him by the well, they think he's an Egyptian. He probably looks very much like an Egyptian at that point in time. There's other reasons why it could be, but just from a most basic point, they call him an Ish Mitzri. At the end of his life, he's called an Eved Hashem, the way of God, a servant of God. So if you were to track those, and if you were to sort of, like, meaning if you were to make a graph of it, it sounds like, if you have time on the bottom axis, and then sort of spiritual ascent on the other, you'll have Moshe starting at the bottom and rising to the top, and Noach starting at the top and at the bottom. So their graphs cross, right? So why is that? So the Meshech Chochma's observation is, and again, this is all his own creative thought, which is observing over here. Here's the following: Ha'inyan, in the second line on the top of page 5. There are two ways in the service of God. Derech echad mi shemiyached atzmo le'avodaso yisborach u'mispodeid, v'yesh mi she'osek b'tzorchet tzibur mevatel atzmo b'shel haklal. So there's two types of people. They're the people who are close to themselves and are completely self-focused in terms of making themselves better people. I'm going to just figure myself out. I'm going to spend all the time working at. I'm going to sit there and study and reflect and do. That's person number one. Person number two is they move themselves out into community and they mevatel themselves to the klal. Umafkir nafshoy avuram, and they so to speak they almost like make themselves ownerless towards the community. Imkain tzarich leimar lifi musag shezeh shemispoided yale mala mala v'zeh yered mamadrega osai. You would think intuitively that the person who closes themselves will ascend and ascend and ascend because they're spending so much time on growth, and the person who's essentially washing dishes for the public is going to have nothing accomplished because they're just spending their time looking after the public. He's skipping the quotations over here. He says, and let's get to the point of it says is, however, he points out that it's the opposite. That a person who's going to close themselves may be a tzaddik at the beginning, like Noach, but ultimately, because they're not connected to reality, will ultimately descend to be an Ish Adama. Whereas a person like Moshe Rabbeinu, who sublimates themselves and sacrifices their own personal growth for the growth of those around them, will ultimately ascend as well to be the Eved Hashem, which is a remarkable idea. It's so counterintuitive. It also reflects his own life, right? So he did have those years of cloistering, but then he put himself out, and as was described by Rabbi Herzog in his obituary, that's exactly what he did. He was the person who day and night sacrificed himself for the community and stood there even in the most difficult of times. So just a very, very fascinating observation about the way this works, which is completely counterintuitive to the way we think about things. The Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk was very much attuned to world events, and a number of huge world events occurred during his lifetime, one of which was the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was signed by Lord Balfour in 1917, towards the end of World War I, the Great War. And this was while the French and the British were arrogantly carving up the Middle East, which is why World War I happened in the first place, as the Ottoman Empire is crumbling and all the colonial empires are eyeing its territory. So as the Allied powers are starting to win, Picot and Sykes, right, start dividing up the Middle East, and that's where, there's the British mandate and the French mandate, right? Lebanon is French, Palestine is English. They start dividing up the Middle East, and at such a point, there's a lot of lobbying which is going on. And by the way, who is a very famous Jew who's found in London at this point in time? Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, who was part of that lobbying effort. He went to the Agudas Israel Convention in 1914 and was exiled through the entire process of World War I, could not make it back to Israel. And so he spent some time in Switzerland, ultimately making his way to England. And he was actually involved in this lobbying effort as well. And Lord Balfour says the following. He sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, and he says, I have the pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, who will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done by which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights or political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation, signed by Lord Balfour. This is called the Balfour Declaration, which is a remarkable watershed moment in Jewish history. Now, at this point in time, it is still a dream, because World War I is not finished yet, and this has not yet been accepted by the world community. However, it is accepted by the world community, by the League of Nations at a conference which was had in San Remo in 1921, I believe. 1920 was the San Remo conference, in which they agreed to create the Jewish homeland in the British Mandate of Palestine. Remarkable achievement. Says the Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk, who's now still alive at this point in time. He wrote the following comment, and this is a very important comment to be aware of, because one of the many claims which is had against the religious Zionist movement is the claim which is what's called the Shalosh Shavuos. In fact, that is the name of the essay of the Satmar Rebbe, Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, in his work Vayoel Moshe. The first essay is called the Shalosh Shavuos, because there's a Gemara at the end of Ksuvos, which we just finished recently, in the daf, which describes on Kuf Yud Aleph that there are 3 oaths. Hishpati eschem benos Yerushalayim, im ta'iru, im ta'iru es hava techpatz. The pasuk says in Shir HaShirim that you're not allowed to do 3 things. Well, actually, there's 2 of them about us, and one of them is about the non-Jewish nations, and one of them is Shelo Ya'alu b'Chochma. It is not appropriate for the nation of Israel to ascend en masse or by force to the land of Israel ad shetechpatz, until the right time. When is that? Very hard to know. And that means that we're not allowed to ascend against the will of the non-Jewish nations around us. Now, it happens to be that one of the other Shalosh Shavuos was that the nations of the world should not to treat us terribly, right? Which leads either many people like that. And Ezra is going to say, it's a bilateral agreement, right? When you've killed us so many times, right? When you've treated us like dirt unaccountably, then the other part of the agreement doesn't hold either, right? Just to understand how this works. But nonetheless, there are those who say that Jews will just wait submissively till we're killed enough, and then at a certain point when Meshech comes, then we'll be taken back to the land of Israel. But we're not going to break the Shalosh Shavuos. That's generally speaking the more we'll call right-wing approach to this, which is why we should never have gone in the first place according to this. Says the Meshech Chochma, when I'm hearing this, I'm going to read from the middle of this paragraph in source 9. It's the last word on the 7th line. He says, now, however, the divine providence has brought together the League of Intelligent Nations, which is a very nice comment to say, because it didn't seem to be too intelligent 20 years later, but that was when they allowed the Germans to rise again. But at this point in time, this is the first international body of its kind, and there was hope that this would bring world peace. In San Remo, and a dictate that was established in the land of Israel shall be for the Jewish people. Since the fear of the oaths has been removed, with the permission of the nations, the mitzvah of settlement of the land arises, a mitzvah equal to all other precepts in the Torah, and this mitzvah returns to its place. It is a mitzvah on everyone to help with all their power to observe this mitzvah, and if Hashem, may His name be blessed, will allow this to come about. And if the matter will increase and expand, then surely it is a matter which stands at the zenith of the universe. Meaning, what the Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk is saying is that the Shalosh Shavuos have ended upon the vote in the San Remo conference. That is remarkable. Meaning, this is not Shelo Ya'alu b'Chochma anymore, because the nations, the League of Nations representing the world at this point in time, before it became a defunct organization representing most of the Arab interests and states, right, later on as the United Nations, but at this point in time when it actually really truly represented the world in powers, it said the Jews could go back to their homeland, which means that the Hussar, the Shalosh Shavuos were removed, and therefore we could go back. That is his observation. That's a remarkable thing to say, and to appreciate this within the scope of our living. He also makes observation about diaspora Jewry. This is so terrifying. What he says. Remember that the latest he could have possibly written this was in 1926, because remember he doesn't publish his manuscript. And he dies in 1926. The latest this could possibly be written is 1926. It's probably earlier. So now bearing that in mind, let's read this next section together, because it's so chilling. He says, "Hine." This is in Parashat B'chukah, dealing with the curses. He says, "Derech hashgacha," the way of God's way of running the world. Ki anuchu meshech shanim karov l'mea omosayim, that the nation of Israel will dwell in one country for maybe 100. maybe 200 years. Then a storm will arise. And it will spread out its waves. Will sweep away without mercy the nation of Israel. And everybody will run scattered in different directions. They'll go to faraway places. Then they'll regroup. The Jews will regroup in their new place. There will be a nation again. Yugdal Torasam, they'll create great institutions of Torah. Chochmasam Yasu Chayil, their wisdom will be incredible. Ad ki yishkach yasa ger ba'aretz nachriya, and then they're going to say, we're Spanish Jews, we're American Jews, we're Lithuanian Jews, we're Russian Jews. We are the people of this place. And then he says, Yachshov ki b'makom zeh imach tzavasai, and they say, this is our place. After all, we've invested in the institutions we made, and the schools we made, and the houses we bought. And they will no longer search for Hashem's redemption. Then a much greater storm will arise in their new place. And the storm will remind them, you are a Jew, you are not a Spaniard, you are not an Italian, you are not a German. Go to a land you do not know. Just look at history. He's not referring to Direi Yamim as in the book of Direi Yamim. He says, look at the annals of Jewish history. Look how long every time we've stayed in one country and how long it's lasted. And then he gets more specific. He goes on. I skipped a paragraph or two in the middle here, in the actual writings, and he says, "Kachi darko shel umma." This is the third paragraph. Shekasher yikansu le'eretz nachriya yu einam b'nei Torah. A lot of times they'll be washed ashore in another country, and they'll be very weak in their belief system. Kasher nidaldelu minatzaros like zeros, because as a function of all the terrible suffering they've had to go through. Va'girush, and the expulsion. Va'achach yisorer bohem ruach eloki hashoev b'am la'ashivam nimkor chotzvoi machzeves kodsham. And they'll say, we need to find our culture. Yilmadu yarbitzu Torah. They'll learn. They'll teach Torah. Yasu niflaos. They'll do amazing things in that country. Ad ki yamod keren Torah al rumov esiyah. And then there'll be this new establishment of a Torah-centered society in that place. Haloi ein biyad hador lo isif ma liskader neged avosam. Ma yaseh chevetz ha'adam asu liskader lechadesh. He points out that in the human spirit is this will to always overturn and progress beyond our parents, right? So every generation has to progress against something new, which is what we're seeing today. Meaning that's why the progressive movement today is so ridiculous. Meaning the battles they've won in yesteryear, they're not enough. You need to now, even gender isn't a thing anymore, right? We have to progress, we have to always overturn what the previous generation did, right? Just for the sake of, so he's saying, so you've established now a new society, but it's not good enough. So the next generation needs to progress. And they said, look, you established what you needed for your Torah, for your culture. That's nice, but they'll say, antiquated, backwaters, all that stuff that our parents, that was there. They'll say, we now belong, as Mendelssohn would say, a Jew in the home and a mensch in the street, right? We will now enter into society because we're going to progress from where our parents were. And they'll leave their learning of their culture and their religion. And they'll learn from the negative things and not from the good things. And they'll say that Berlin is Jerusalem. I mean, can you imagine this? And then he says, and you've done the worst of them, meaning you'll become more German than the Germans. That's what he would say. Don't be so happy. But the storm is coming, as it always comes. And this is said well before the Holocaust. And by the way, there was incipient anti-Semitism in every country. In France, we just kind of finished at this point in time the entire Dreyfus affair. But the German, that actually checked French anti-Semitism for a few generations. but German anti-Semitism was still rising. Jews were in the highest echelons in Prussian society. The richest people in Germany at this point in time were Jews, right? But nonetheless, the Warburgs controlled the entire banking system in Hamburg. Where we had the entire owner, the controller of Hapag, which is the greatest shipping company in the world, which is German at this point in time, is a Jew. So this is a very significant period in time. But he says, watch out, be very careful. And again, it's something which shouldn't just be then. It seems to be the continuous story of Jewish history. Very, very, very salient point which he raises. Let's look at a few other pieces. And this piece we came across, actually we studied a few years ago when we looked at natural morality. This is again his fascinating insight into the human spirit, where he points out in Sefer Shmos, in the end of Parshas Mishpatim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, "Vayamar Hashem Moshe, Alei Elai Hahara v'Yesham, come out to me in the mountain and be there. I'm going to give you the tablets, and I'm going to give you the Torah and the mitzvahs which I have written." So the Meshech Chochma says, what Torah is that exactly? Like the Torah hasn't been written yet. I mean, like the luchos we got. Where's the Torah? Where did that come from? The Torah hasn't been written yet. There's a whole discussion as to whether it's Megillas Nitnu, or is it Chasuma Nitnu, is it the whole thing? But what Torah is he giving Moshe Rabbeinu then? Says the Meshech Chochma, again, listen to this remarkable insight. He says, HaTorah mitzvah, he hasn't written the Torah yet. The Torah as we have it today has not been finished yet. Right? It's in the process of being written. Right? And he goes on, the Gemara says in Eruvin, that there are certain things we learn from the natural world around us. He says, Lachein, Omar asher kosavti b'sefer ateva, asher yitzurasi yitzarti shezeh sefer shel Hashem yisbarach hayotzra. What did I write? The natural order is the book I wrote. Is that remarkable? Meaning, says the Meshech Chochma, when you want to understand my morality, read my book. It's called The Universe. That's a remarkable perspective. That's quite an avant-garde perspective to share. In fact, and I thank Abby for sharing this, the Rav Yehuda Amital's book, V'aretz Nasani V'nei Adam, with me, which is really remarkable. Rav Yehuda Amital's insights. He points to the Meshech Chochma and he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu bara ha'adam b'tzelem Elokim v'chanan asa b'regishas musaris matzpunit musar TV. Hashem gave us the Torah to instruct us, but He also gave us to instruct us. That does not mean to say that every time I feel like eating something, I go over to the pantry. That's not what he means. But what he means to say is that if we were to be able to listen to our conscience usually tells us what's right. We usually ignore it. Right? You know, it says, I really want the chocolate cake. No, you don't want the chocolate cake, right? If we were to listen properly enough, we know, like whenever we ask a question, I can technically speaking, Rabbi, I can really, do something to somebody, but, I'm not sure if you're asking the question, the reason why you're asking that question is because your conscience is telling you the answer. You're just trying to make sure that you can sublimate that, right? So just listen. That's Asher Kosavti Laharasam, which the Meshech Chochma says. So be very sensitive also to the natural morality. If there's a revulsion to something as well, that means to say that it should be a revulsion. We should not overexpose ourselves to death, to murder, to what's going on in the news, to the point that we now become we are completely apathetic to what's going on around, because it is meant to be there's a revulsion felt to these things as well. One or two other things, we'll just close with this, just because there's so many powerful perspectives. Dr. Yeager pointed this one to me, and there are so many ones that Dr. Yeager pointed to me, but this one is a remarkable thesis. And that is you see, we know this, but it's a half-truth that we know. We know that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of the three sins of Gila, Ras, Shrichas, Damim, and Avodah Zarah. We know the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam. What we don't know is that those two different, we'll call it, types of sins operate differently in whether it depends on the community versus the individual. What does that mean? He says this by Kriyas Yamsuf. Such an observation. This is this week. He says, he says, listen, look at the way the Torah operates. Here's the operating principle. when it comes to ritual problems, like egregious actions, right? Then in those cases there are very severe deaths that the Torah prescribes for avodah zarah, for adultery, idolatry, and for murder. When it comes to characteristics, the Torah does not mandate capital punishment for that, right? The Torah does not say you get killed for telling lashon hara. Right? The Torah does not mandate such a terrible punishment. Ein malchus because it can't be quantified in the same way. He says, Ulam ze dafka b'yachid ha'oseh. That's when it's an individual who's doing a character flaw. He says, but when it comes to a nation which is performing a character flaw, then it's much worse. Then in a certain sense it rolls over the capital. It's worse than doing it as a nation. We'll call the ritual and social offenses. So that's why his observation is that when you have a generation, let's say the generation of Achav, that are working cohesively, character-wise, they are very healthy, but ritually and socially they are very decrepit, punishment does not come. But when you have a generation like David, where they're perhaps ritually, socially doing well, but character-wise they're fighting, there's going to be losses in battle. That's why the exile of the first Beis HaMikdash is going to be 70 years, maybe even 52 years, whereas the second Beis HaMikdash is going to be much longer, because when a nation is perpetrating character flaw, that's much worse than an individual perpetrating character flaws. So it switches depending on how decrepit the society is. Isn't that remarkable? That's the perspective. It's a much longer essay, but this is his observation. And why is he bringing this up at the sea? He says his question is why is it that when the angels of Egypt are saying halal of avodah zarah, they only make this claim at the sea. They don't make this claim for the 10 plagues in Egypt. Meaning, why is it that the Jews are being favored, the Hebrews are being favored in having clean water, and the Egyptians are drinking blood? Their angels should say, wait a second, they're just they're basically Egyptians, right? Why doesn't the angel make that claim? So because in Egypt they were still a cohesive unit. At the sea, under terror of being pursued, that's when they broke up into groups. And this one said, let's fight. This one says, let's pray. This one says, let's run away. This one says, let's go into the sea. When they start fighting, the character, so to speak, the unity of the nation falls apart. As that falls apart, then everything else splits. And that's when castigation enters. That's his observation as well. We're going to skip a couple. I just want to end with perhaps this point, because this one is so important. You know that it says in Gan Eden, the first mitzvah of the Torah is, and you remember what's the first mitzvah? The first commandment that God spoke to a human being, commanded them, saying is? So actually the first mitzvah most people say is don't eat from the Eitz Hadas, right? Now, good question. That seems to be a humanity. You're right. That does seem, but it's a blessing. It seems to be given to the animals too. But it was a command or a blessing. But it does. The first time the divine turns to the human being and says do or don't do something, most people say is not to eat from the tree, which is not correct, because the first mitzvah is to eat from all the trees. That's in the second parak of Bereshis, where it says Vayisav Hashem Elokim el Adam lemor mikol eitz hagan ochel tochel. Eat from the mangoes, the bananas, the strawberries, have everything. The second mitzvah is, there's one tree, don't eat that one, right? That's how it works. So how many mitzvahs are there at the beginning? 2. And which is a broader scope? Mitzvah number 1. Because the first one is much broader. That includes everything. The mangoes, the apples, the bananas, the oranges, that's all included in mitzvah number 1. Eat all that. By the way, that don't eat. That's a small scope of mitzvah. When Chava, now the question is, how does humanity understand this? We can ask them, because we can hear how they reflect on God's reflections, right? Meaning, communication is a consistent broken chain of communication. So how does Chava interpret what God said to them? Well, we hear, because she reports it to the snake. So in the next parak, when she describes what God had said to her, she says, we may eat. You see what she did over here? She already got rid of the first mitzvah. Nochel means, if technically speaking in Hebrew, is we may eat, not must, may. Just you want to go through the linguistics of here correctly. Which means that she says about the mangoes, the bananas, and the oranges, that is all neutral, right? When it came to the only thing that God told us was don't eat that, which means her view of God, her conception of God when He speaks to human beings is neutral and negative, right? It's all right to do what you want, but just don't do that. Whereas that wasn't what God said to humanity. God says, I want you to do this. I want you to eat. And by the way, there's a restriction over there in the corner, right? Don't do that. That's the way. So therefore, there's two ways of understanding this. The Meshech Chochma says, is that when you have positive mitzvahs, when you're doing something with kavanah, then you're protected by that mitzvah. But if you don't have the kavanah when you're doing it, then you're not protected by that. Meaning, if you're just eating a mango and you think that this is irrelevant to God, right? Then you're not protected by that mitzvah, right? Psychologically perspective, you put it in a different way, is if your view of God is simply neutral and negative, then you're not going to hold on to that system, right? And you're going to be susceptible to the snakes of reality around you. But if you understand that God's foremost request, foremost commandment is positive, you're protected, and you're now going to also have the buy-in in that system as well. It's just a perspective, again, the sharpness of the perspective of here, we're looking at the words of as well. I'll just conclude with the last piece over here, and this is that he points out that there were two different tests that were for each generation of the first generations. So when the people came out of the flood, the biggest issue was a corruption of humanity on a base level. Is bestiality, there was theft, there was all kinds of problems that were going on in society. When they corrected that, out emerged a person who was, so to speak, the son, his name was Shem, and the son of Noach, and he became the king of, the priest of, a place called Shalem. And Shalem reflected this idea of Shlemus, right? I'm just not an animal anymore. I'm no longer acting like an animal. So that generation reformed itself by Shlemus. The next generation, a few generations later, they had this thing called the Torah Palaga, which is really a corruption of the philosophical, theological sense. Avraham Avinu was born in that generation, and he turned to that generation and he explained that intellectually there's God, and you need to understand there's this God. It was the next step. It was graduating from just not being an animal. It's now being a believing human being. Good. And therefore, when he made his greatest success at Har HaMoriah, this is called the Har Hashem Yira'eh. Right, Yira'eh was what he brought to the world, not Shalem. That was step one. Thank you, Shem. The second step was Yira'eh. So he says, and this is, people know this idea, it comes from the Meshech Chochma. He says, that's why we have this place called Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the combination of both of those concepts. First of all, being Shalem, and number two, being a Yira'eh. Right? Yireh Hashem. You need to first be, so to speak, act like a human being, and now act like a human being who understands monotheism. Those are two, called anthropological developments of the religious human. And they were put together in this place called Yerushalayim, which is why it is called as it is. Shalem is Jerusalem, Har Hashem Yira'eh is Har Moriah, which is in fact the same place as well. Fascinating, beautiful perspective. Folks, we didn't even touch the edge of the iceberg here, because there's so much more. But I hope it gives a little bit of perspective into this remarkable human being who really changed the way that we think about Torah in so many ways. Have a wonderful, meaningful week.